Chapter 17 of The Cat of Bubastes, A Tale of Ancient Egypt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Cat of Bubastes by G. A. Henty. Chapter 17 Out of Egypt. The river had begun to rise before they left Thebes, and although it had not yet reached its highest point, a great volume of water was pouring down, and the boatmen assured Jethro that they would be able to ascend the cataract without difficulty, whereas when the Nile was low there was often great danger in passing, and at times indeed no boats could make the passage. 10 men were engaged in addition to the crew to take the boats up beyond the rapids. But though assured that there was no danger, the girls declared that they would rather walk along the bank, for the hurry and rush of the mighty flood, rising sometimes in short, angry waves, were certainly trying to the nerves. Jethro and the lads of course accompanied them, and sometimes seized the rope and added their weight when the force of the stream brought the men towing to a standstill, and seemed as if it would, in spite of their efforts, tear the boat from their grasp. At last the top of the rapids was gained, and they were glad to take their places again in the boat as she floated on the quiet water. So a month passed, sometimes taken along by favorable winds, at others being towed along quiet waters close to the shore, at others battling with the furious rapids. They found that the cataract they had first passed was as nothing to those higher up. Here the whole cargo had to be unloaded and carried up to the top of the rapids, and it needed some 40 men to drag the empty boat through the turmoil of waters, while often the slightest error on the part of the helmsman would have caused the boat to be dashed to pieces on the great rocks rising in the midst of the channel. But before arriving at the second cataract they had tarried for several days at Ibsciak, the city to which their crew belonged. They had passed many temples and towns during the 180 miles of journey between Syene and this place, but this was the largest of them. Here 2 great grotto temples were in course of construction, the one dedicated to the gods Amun and Phre, and built at the expense of Rameses himself, the other dedicated to Athor by Lofreai the queen. On these temples were engraved the records of the victories of Rameses over various nations of Africa and Asia. Jethro offered, if the boatmen wished to make a longer stay here, that he would charter another boat to take them further, but they declared their willingness to proceed at the end of a week after their arrival, being well satisfied with their engagement and treatment. After passing the second cataract they arrived at another large town named Beni. This was a very large city and abounded with temples and public buildings. The largest temple was dedicated to Thoth. All along the river a belt of cultivated land extended for some miles back from the bank. This was dotted with numerous villages, and there was no difficulty whatever in obtaining food of all kinds. At last they reached Semneh, the point to which the boatmen had agreed to take them. This was the furthest boundary to which at that time the Egyptian power extended. The river here took a great bend to the east, then flowing south and afterward again west, forming a great loop. This could be avoided by cutting across the desert to Merawi, a flourishing town which marked the northern limit of the power of Meroe, the desert forming a convenient neutral ground between the 2 kingdoms. Sometimes Egypt under a powerful king carried her arms much further to the south, at other times a warlike monarch of Meroe would push back the Egyptian frontier almost to Syene, but as a rule the Nile as far as Semneh was regarded as belonging to Egypt. The traders arriving at Semneh generally waited until a sufficient number were gathered together to form a strong caravan for mutual protection against the natives inhabiting the desert, who held themselves independent alike of Egypt and of Meroe, and attacked and plundered parties crossing the desert, unless these were so strong and well armed as to be able to set them at defiance. Erecting 2 tents and landing their goods and merchandise, Jethro and his party encamped near the river bank. They had not yet settled whether they would cross the desert or continue their journey by water. The choice between the 2 routes was open to them, for although the traders usually crossed the desert, taking with them their lighter and more valuable merchandise, the heavier goods made the long detour in boats, going up in large flotillas, both for protection against the natives and for mutual aid in ascending the rapids which had to be encountered. There was no difficulty in hiring another boat, for it was the universal rule to make a transshipment here, as the Egyptian boatmen were unwilling to enter Meroe. The transport beyond this point, therefore, was in the hands of the people of this country. In consultation with the traders gathered at Semneh, Jethro learned that it was by no means necessary to proceed up the river to the city of Meroe and thence eastward through Axum, the capital of Abyssinia, to the sea, but that a far shorter road existed from the easternmost point of the bend of the river direct to the sea. There were, indeed, several large Egyptian towns upon the Red Sea, and from these a flourishing trade was carried on with Meroe and Abyssinia. And the first merchant to whom Jethro spoke was much surprised to find that he was in ignorance of the existence of the route he had described. The journey, although toilsome, was said to be no more so than that from Meroe through Axum, while the distance to be traversed was small in comparison. After much consultation it was therefore agreed that the best plan was to dispose of the merchandise that they had brought with them to one of the traders about to proceed south, retaining only sufficient for the payment of the men whom it would be necessary to take with them for protection on their journey. Jethro had no difficulty in doing this, alleging as his reason for parting with his goods that he found that the expenses to Meroe would greatly exceed the sum he had calculated upon, and that therefore he had determined to proceed no further. As they thought it best to allow 6 months from the date of their departure from Thebes to elapse before they entered any large Egyptian town, they remained for nearly 2 months at Semneh, and then finding that a flotilla of boats was ready to ascend the river, they made an arrangement with some boatmen for the hire of their craft to the point where they were to leave the river, and again set out on their journey. The difficulties of the journey were very great. After traveling for some 60 miles they came to rapids more dangerous than any they had passed, and it took the flotilla more than a fortnight passing up them, only 4 or 5 boats being taken up each day by the united labors of the whole of the crews. There was great satisfaction when the last boat had been taken up the rapids, and there was a general feast that evening among the boatmen. During the whole time they had been engaged in the passage a number of armed scouts had been placed upon the rocky eminences near the bank, for the place had an evil reputation, and attacks were frequently made by the desert tribesmen upon those passing up or down upon the river. So far no signs of the presence of hostile natives had been perceived. The usual precautions, however, had been taken. The cargoes had all been carried up by hand and deposited so as to form a breastwork, and as night closed in several sentries were placed to guard against surprise. It had been arranged that the men belonging to the boats each day brought up should that night take sentinel duty, and this evening Jethro, his companions and boatmen were among those on guard. Many of the boats had left Semneh before them, and they had been among the last to arrive at the foot of the cataracts, and consequently came up in the last batch. As owners they had been exempt from the labors of dragging up the boats, and had spent much of their time during the enforced delay in hunting. They had obtained dogs and guides from the village at the foot of the cataracts, and had had good sport among the ibex which abounded in the rocky hills. The girls had seldom left their cabin after leaving Semneh. There was nothing remarkable in the presence of women in a boat going so far up the river, as many of the traders took their wives on their journeys with them. When, however, they journeyed beyond Semneh they left them there until their return, the danger and hardships of the desert journey being too great for them to encounter, and it was therefore thought advisable that the girls should remain in seclusion. Jethro, Amuba, and Chebron were standing together at one of the angles of the encampment when the former suddenly exclaimed: "There are men or animals moving on that steep hill opposite. I thought several times I heard the sound of stones being displaced. I certainly heard them then." Then turning round he raised his voice. "I can hear sounds on the hill. It were best that all stood to their arms and prepare to resist an attack." In an instant the sound of song and laughter ceased amid the groups assembled round the fires, and each man seized his arms. There was a sharp ringing sound close to Jethro, and stooping he picked up an arrow which had fallen close to him. "It is an enemy," he shouted. "Draw up close to the breastwork and prepare to receive them. Scatter the fires at once and extinguish the blazing brands. They can see us, while themselves invisible." As he spoke a loud and terrible yell rose from the hillside, and a shower of arrows was poured into the encampment. Several men fell, but Jethro's orders were carried out and the fires promptly extinguished. "Stoop down behind the breastwork," Jethro shouted, "until they are near enough for you to take aim. Have your spears ready to check their onslaught when they charge." Although Jethro held no position entitling him to command, his orders were as promptly obeyed as if he had been in authority. The men recognized at once, by the calmness of his tones, that he was accustomed to warfare, and readily yielded to him obedience. In a minute or two a crowd of figures could be seen approaching, and the Egyptians, leaping to their feet, poured in a volley of arrows. The yells and screams which broke forth testified to the execution wrought in the ranks of the enemy, but without a check they still rushed forward. The Egyptians discharged their arrows as fast as they could during the few moments left them, and then, as the natives rushed at the breastwork, they threw down their bows, and grasping the spears, maces, swords, axes, or staves with which they were armed, boldly met the foe. For a few minutes the contest was doubtful, but encouraged by the shouts of Jethro, whose voice could be heard above the yells of the natives, the Egyptians defended their position with vigor and courage. As fast as the natives climbed over the low breastwork of merchandise they were either speared or cut down, and after 10 minutes' fierce fighting their attack ceased as suddenly as it had begun, and as if by magic a dead silence succeeded the din of battle. "You have done well, comrades," Jethro said, "and defeated our assailants, but we had best stand to arms for a while, for they may return. I do not think they will, for they have found us stronger and better prepared for them than they had expected. Still, as we do not know their ways, it were best to remain on our guard." An hour later, as nothing had been heard of the enemy, the fires were relighted and the wounded attended to. 16 men had been shot dead by the arrows of the assailants, and some 50 were more or less severely wounded by the same missiles, while 18 had fallen in the hand-to-hand contest at the breastwork. 37 natives were found dead inside the breastwork. How many had fallen before the arrows of the defenders the latter never knew, for it was found in the morning that the natives had carried off their killed and wounded who fell outside the enclosure. As soon as the fighting was over Chebron ran down to the boat to allay the fears of the girls and assure them that none of their party had received a serious wound, Jethro alone having been hurt by a spear thrust, which, however, glanced off his ribs, inflicting only a flesh wound, which he treated as of no consequence whatever. "Why did not Amuba come down with you?" Mysa asked. "Are you sure that he escaped without injury?" "I can assure you that he has not been touched, Mysa, but we are still on guard. For it is possible that the enemy may return again, although we hope that the lesson has been sufficient for them." "Were you frightened, Chebron?" "I felt a little nervous as they were coming on, but when it came to hand fighting I was too excited to think anything about the danger. Besides, I was standing between Jethro and Amuba, and they have fought in great battles, and seemed so quiet and cool that I could scarcely feel otherwise. Jethro took the command of everyone, and the rest obeyed him without question. But now I must go back to my post. Jethro told me to slip away to tell you that we were all safe, but I should not like not to be in my place if they attack again." "I have often wondered, Ruth," Mysa said when Chebron had left them, "what we should have done if it had not been for Jethro and Amuba. If it had not been for them I should have been obliged to marry Plexo, and Chebron would have been caught and killed at Thebes. They arrange everything, and do not seem afraid in the slightest." "I think your brother is brave too," Ruth said, "and they always consult with him about their plans." "Yes, but it is all their doing," Mysa replied. "Chebron, before they came, thought of nothing but reading, and was gentle and quiet. I heard one of the slaves say to another that he was more like a girl than a boy. But being with Amuba has quite altered him. Of course he is not as strong as Amuba, but he can walk and run and shoot an arrow and shoot a javelin at a mark almost as well as Amuba can. Still he has not so much spirit. I think Amuba always speaks decidedly, while Chebron hesitates to give an opinion." "But your brother has a great deal more learning than Amuba, and so his opinion ought to be worth more, Mysa." "Oh, yes, if it were about history or science, for anything of that sort of course it would, Ruth. But not about other things. Of course it is natural that they should be different, because Amuba is the son of a king." "The son of a king!" Ruth repeated in surprise. "Yes, I heard it when he first came, only father said it was not to be mentioned, because if it were known he would be taken away from us, and kept as a royal slave at the palace. But he is really the son of a king, and as his father is dead he will be king himself when he gets back to his own country." "And Jethro is one of the same people, is he not?" Ruth asked. "Oh, yes, they are both Rebu. I think Jethro was one of the king's warriors." "That accounts," Ruth said, "for what has often puzzled me. Jethro is much the oldest of our party, and altogether the leader, and yet I have observed that he always speaks to Amuba as if the latter were the chief." "I have not noticed that," Mysa said, shaking her head; "but I do know, now that you mention it, that he always asked Amuba's opinion before giving his own." "I have constantly noticed it, Mysa, and I wondered that since he and Amuba were your father's slaves he should always consult Amuba instead of your brother; but I understand now. That accounts too for Amuba giving his opinion so decidedly. Of course in his own country Amuba was accustomed to have his own way. I am glad of that, for I like Amuba very much, and it vexed me sometimes to see him settling things when Jethro is so much older. And you think if he ever gets back to his own country he will be king?" "I am not sure," Mysa said doubtfully. "Of course he ought to be. I suppose there is some other king now, and he might not like to give up to Amuba." "I don't suppose we shall ever get there," Ruth said. "Amuba said the other day that this country lay a great distance further than the land of my people came from a long time ago." "But that is not so very far, Ruth. You said that the caravans went in 6 or 7 days from that part of Egypt where you dwelt to the east of the Great Sea where your fathers came from. But we are a long way from there, Mysa. But if it is only 6 or 7 days' journey, why did not your people go back again, Ruth?" "They always hoped to go back some day, Mysa, but I don't think your people would have let them go. You see, they made them useful for building and cutting canals and other work. Besides, other people dwell now in the land they came from, and these would not turn out unless they were beaten in battle. My people are not accustomed to fight. Besides, they have stopped so long that they have become as the Egyptians. For the most part they talk your language, although some have also preserved the knowledge of their own tongue. They worship your gods, and if they were not forced to labor against their will, I think now that most of them would prefer to live in ease and plenty in Egypt rather than journey into a strange country, of which they know nothing except that their forefathers hundreds of years ago came thence. But here are the others," she broke off as the boat heeled suddenly over as someone sprang on board. "Now we shall hear more about the fighting." The next day the journey was continued, and without further adventure the flotilla arrived at last at the town where the party would leave the river and strike for the coast. Having unloaded their goods and discharged the boat, Jethro hired a small house until arrangements were made for their journey to the seacoast. El Makrif was a place of no great importance. A certain amount of trade was carried on with the coast, but most of the merchants trading with Meroe preferred the longer but safer route through Axum. Still parties of travelers passed up and down and took boat there for Meroe, but there was an absence of the temples and great buildings which had distinguished every town they had passed between Thebes and Semneh. Jethro upon inquiry found that there were wells at the camping places along the whole route. The people were wild and savage, the Egyptian power extending only from the seashore to the foot of the hills, some 15 miles away. Occasionally expeditions were got up to punish the tribesmen for their raids upon the cultivated land of the coast, but it was seldom that the troops should come upon them, for, knowing every foot of the mountains, these eluded all search by their heavy armed adversaries. Jethro found that the custom was for merchants traveling across this country to pay a fixed sum in goods for the right of passage. There were 2 chiefs claiming jurisdiction over the road, and a messenger was at once dispatched to the nearest of these with the offer of the usual payment and a request for an escort. A week later 4 wild-looking figures presented themselves at the house and stated that they were ready to conduct the travelers through their chief's territory. Jethro had already made arrangements with the head man of the place to furnish him with 12 men to carry the provisions necessary for the journey, and upon the following morning the party started, and Mysa and Ruth assumed the garb of boys, Jethro finding that although traders might bring up the ladies of their family to Semneh, or even take them higher up the river in boats, they would never think of exposing them to the fatigue of a journey across the mountains, and that the arrival of two girls at the Egyptian town on the sea would therefore assuredly attract remark, and possibly inquiry, on the part of the authorities. For the first few hours the girls enjoyed the change of traveling after the long confinement on the boat, but long before nightfall they longed for the snug cushions and easy life they had left behind. The bearers, heavy laden as they were, proceeded at a steady pace that taxed the strength of the girls to keep up with after the first few miles were passed. The heat of the sun was intense. The country after a short distance had been passed became barren and desolate. They did not suffer from thirst, for an ample supply of fruit was carried by one of the bearers, but their limbs ached, and their feet, unused to walking, became tender and painful. "Can we not stop for a while, Jethro?" Mysa asked beseechingly. Jethro shook his head. "We must keep on to the wells. They are 2 hours further yet. They told us at starting that the first day's journey was 6 hours steady walking." Mysa was about to say that she could walk no further, when Ruth whispered in her ear, "We must not give way, Mysa. You know we promised that if they would take us with them, we would go through all difficulties and dangers without complaining." The admonition had its effect. Mysa felt ashamed that she had been on the point of giving way on the very first day of their starting on their real journey, and struggled bravely on; but both girls were utterly exhausted by the time they arrived at the wells. They felt rewarded, however, for their sufferings by the hearty commendation Jethro bestowed upon them. "You have held on most bravely," he said, "for I could see you were terribly fatigued. I am afraid you will find it very hard work just at first, but after that it will be more easy to you. Tomorrow's journey is a shorter one." It was well that it was so, for the girls were limping even at the start, and needed the assistance of Jethro and the boys to reach the next halting place, and as soon as the tent, which was separated into two parts by hangings, was erected, they dropped upon their cushions, feeling that they could never get through another day's suffering like that they had just passed. Jethro saw that this was so, and told their escort that he must halt next day, for that his young sons had been so long in the boat that the fatigue had quite overcome them. He accompanied the intimation with a present to each of the four men. They offered no objections, while the porters, who were paid by the day, were well contented with the halt. The day's rest greatly benefited the girls, but it was not long enough to be of any utility to their feet. These, however, they wrapped in bandages, and started in good spirits when the porters took up the loads. They were now following the course of what in wet weather was a stream in the mountains. Sometimes the hills on either side receded a little, at others they rose almost perpendicularly on either side of the stream, and they had to pick their way among great boulders and rocks. This sort of walking, however, tired the girls less than progressing along a level. Their feet were painful, but the soft bandages in which they were enveloped hurt them far less than the sandals in which they had at first walked, and they arrived at the halting place in much better condition than on the previous occasions. "The worst is over now," Jethro said to them encouragingly. "You will find each day's work come easier to you. You have stood it far better than I expected, and I feel more hopeful now that we shall reach the end of our journey in safety than I have done since the evening when I first agreed to take you with us." While passing through some of the ravines the party had been greatly amused by the antics of troops of apes. Sometimes these sat tranquilly on the hillside, the elder gravely surveying the little caravan, the younger frisking about perfectly unconcerned. Sometimes they would accompany them for a considerable distance, making their way along the rough stones of the hillside at a deliberate pace, but yet keeping up with the footmen below. As the ape was a sacred animal in Egypt, Mysa was gladdened by their sight, and considered it a good omen for the success of their journey. The men who escorted them told them that if undisturbed the apes never attack travelers, but if molested they would at once attack in a body, with such a fury that even 4 or 5 travelers together would have but little chance of escape with their lives. During the first week's journey they saw no other animals, although at night they heard the cries of hyenas, who often came close up to the encampment, and once or twice a deep roar which their guide told them was that of a lion. On the 7th day, however, soon after they had started upon their march, The sound of breaking branches was heard among some trees a short distance up the hillside, and immediately afterward the heads of 4 or 5 great beasts could be seen above the mimosa bushes which extended from the wood to the bottom of the hill. The bearers gave a cry of terror, and throwing down their loads took to their heels. The 4 men of the escort stood irresolute. Although none of Jethro's party had ever before seen an elephant, they knew from pictures and carvings, and from the great statues in the island of Elephanta, what these great creatures were. "Will they attack us?" Jethro asked the men. "They do not often do so," one of them replied, "although at times they come down and waste the fields round villages, and will sometimes slay any they come across. But it is best to get out of their way." Jethro pointed out a few of the more valuable packages, and taking these up they entered the bushes on the other slope of the hill and made their way among them as far as they could. This was, however, but a short distance, for they were full of sharp thorns and offered terrible obstacles to passage. All of the party received severe scratches, and their garments suffered much, in making their way but 20 yards into the bush. "That will do," Jethro said. "We shall be torn to pieces if we go further, and we are as much concealed from sight here as we should be another 100 yards further. I will see what they are doing." Standing up and looking cautiously through the screen of feathery leaves, Jethro saw that the elephants were standing immovable. Their great ears were erected and their trunks outstretched as if scenting the air. After 2 or 3 minutes' hesitation they continued to descend the hill. "Are they afraid of man?" Jethro asked one of the escort. "Sometimes they are seized with a panic and fly at the approach of a human being, but if attacked they will charge any number without hesitation." "Do you ever hunt them?" "Sometimes, but always with a great number of men. It is useless to shoot arrows at them, the only way is to crawl out behind and cut the back sinews of their legs. It needs a strong man and a sharp sword, but it can be done. Then they are helpless, but even then it is a long work to dispatch them. Generally we drive them from our villages by lighting great fires and making noises. Solitary elephants are more dangerous than a herd. I have known one of them kill a dozen men, seizing some in his trunk and throwing them in the air as high as the top of a lofty tree, dashing others to the ground and kneeling upon them until every bone is crushed to pieces." The elephants had now reached the bottom of the valley, and the chief of the escort held up his hand for perfect silence. All were prepared to fight if the elephants pursued them into the bushes, for further retreat was impossible. Amuba and Chebron had fitted their arrows into the bowstrings and loosened their swords in the scabbards. The 4 natives had drawn the short heavy swords they carried, while Jethro grasped the axe that was his favorite weapon. "Remember," he had whispered to the boys, "the back sinews of the legs are the only useful point to aim at. If they advance, separate, and if they make toward the girls, try to get behind them and hamstring them." There was a long pause of expectation. The elephants could be heard making a low snorting noise with their trunks, and Jethro at last raised himself sufficiently to look through the bushes at what was going on. The elephants were examining the bundles that had been thrown down. "I believe that they are eating up our food," he whispered as he sat down again. Half an hour elapsed, and then there was a sound of breaking the bushes. Jethro again looked out. "Thank the gods!" he exclaimed. "They are going off again." Trampling down the mimosa thicket as if it had been grass, the elephants ascended the opposite hill and at last re-entered the wood from which they had first emerged. The fugitives waited for a quarter of an hour and then made their way out again from the thicket, Jethro cutting a path with his axe through the thorns. An exclamation of surprise broke from them as they gained the open ground. The whole of their stores were tossed about in the wildest confusion. Every one of the packages had been opened. Tents, garments, and carpets hung upon the bushes as if the animals had tossed them contemptuously there, as being unfit to eat. Everything eatable had disappeared. The fruit, grain, and vegetables had been completely cleared up. The skins of wine were bursted, but the contents had been apparently appreciated, for none remained in the hollows of the rocks. "What greedy creatures!" Mysa exclaimed indignantly. "They have not left us a single thing." "They do not often get a chance of such dainty feeding," Amuba said. "I don't think we ought to blame them, especially as they do not seem to have done very much damage to our other goods." "Look how they have trampled down the bushes as they went through. I wish their skins were as thin as mine," Mysa said as she wiped away the blood from a deep scratch on her cheek.
They would keep up in their own woods then and not come down to rob travelers."
"At any rate, Mysa, we ought to feel indebted to them," Chebron said, "for not having pushed their investigations further. We should have had no chance either of escape or resistance in these bushes. Jethro told us to move round and attack them from behind, but moving round in these thorns is all very well to talk about, but quite impossible to do. 2 minutes of active exercise and there would not be a morsel of flesh left on one's bones." It was 2 or 3 hours before the bearers came back one by one. They were assailed with fierce reproaches by Jethro for the cowardice which had been the means of losing all the provisions. 4 of their number were at once paid off and sent back, as there was no longer anything for them to carry. The others would have left also had it not been for the escort, who threatened death if they did not at once take up their burdens and proceed. For Jethro had been liberal with his stores, and they were as indignant as he was himself at the sudden stoppage of their rations. 3 days later they arrived at a small village, which marked the commencement of the territory of the second chief through whose country the road ran. Here the escort and carriers left them, their place being supplied by natives of the village. There was no difficulty in obtaining a supply of grain and goat's milk cheese, but these were a poor substitute for the stores that the elephants had devoured. They were too glad, however, at having accomplished half the toilsome journey to murmur at trifles, and after a day's halt proceeded on their way. Another fortnight's travel and they stood on the lower slopes of the hills, and saw across a wide belt of flat country the expanse of the sea glistening in the sun. 2 more days' journey and they reached the Egyptian trading station. This was situated on a little peninsula connected with the mainland by a narrow neck of land, across which a massive wall had been built to repulse the attacks of the wild tribesmen, who frequently swept down and devastated the cultivated fields up to the very wall. As soon as they entered the town Jethro was ordered by an official to accompany him to the house of the governor. Taking Chebron with him, he left it to Amuba to arrange for the use of a small house during their stay. The governor's inquiries were limited to the state of the country, the behavior of the tribesmen along the road, the state of the wells, and the amount of provisions obtainable along the line of route. "There are a party of Arab traders from the other side who wish to pass up to carry their goods either to Semneh or Meroe, but I have detained them until news should reach me from above, for if any wrong should happen to them their countrymen might probably enough hold us responsible for their deaths, and this might lead to quarrels and loss of trade. But since you have passed through with so small a party there can be no fear, and they can arrange with the people who brought you down as to the amount to be paid to the chiefs for free passage." He inquired Jethro's reason for making the journey over the mountains instead of proceeding by the Nile. He replied that he had received an advantageous offer for all his merchandise, and had disposed of it to a trader going up to Meroe, and that as the Nile had now fallen and the danger in passing down the cataracts was considerable, he thought it better to make the short land journey and to travel by sea to Lower Egypt, especially as he was told that the natives were now friendly, and that no difficulty would be met with on the way. Another reason for his choosing that route was that he might determine whether on his next venture it would not be more advantageous to bring down his merchandise by ship and start from the seashore for Meroe. "Undoubtedly it would be better," the governor said, "but it were wiser to sail another 2 days' journey down the coast, and then to journey by way of Axum." A week's rest completely recruited the strength of the girls, and Jethro then engaged a passage in a trading ship which was going to touch at various small ports on its way north. Chapter 18